Hello friends, how are you? Today, we are going to talk about a very interesting topic, New Zealand, which is known as the pure land on earth. When you think of New Zealand, the first thing that comes to your mind would be the blue sky. White clouds, green grassland, and super healing sheep, right? However, do you know, in recent years, New Zealand is facing a serious problem. More and more people are leaving their home country, and most of them are going to next door Australia. Seriously, this phenomenon is a big contrast, right? New Zealand is obviously a dream country that everyone wants to emigrate. How come they can't keep their own people instead? According to the latest data, every 8.5 New Zealanders, there is one New Zealander who is living in Australia for a long period of time, which is a very alarming ratio. What's even more worrying is the majority of young people who are leaving. Most of them are between 20 to 39 years old, the most dynamic and value-creating group in the labor market. You must be wondering why this is so. New Zealand is such a good environment and the welfare is not bad. Why do people still want to leave? Is there anything particularly attractive about Australia? Today we will analyze this issue properly. From the current situation of the population exodus, the driving factors behind it, to the impact on New Zealand's economy, and whether this predicament can be reversed or not, all of which will be clarified and explained to you. First of all, let's take a look at the severity of New Zealand's population exodus. According to the 2024 migration data just released by Statistics New Zealand 2025, at the end of 2024, 72,000 New Zealand citizens left the country throughout the year, of which 58% chose to settle in Australia, with about 41,800 new people moving to Australia. The total number of New Zealand citizens living permanently in Australia is now close to 624,000 people. This number may seem a little abstract, so let's look at it in more concrete terms by way of comparison. New Zealand's resident population in 2024 will be about 5,338,500, and 624,000 is about 11.7% of that, which means that 1 in 8.5 New Zealanders will be living in Australia permanently. This is a very impressive ratio indeed. More critically, it's the young people who are leaving. New Zealand citizens aged 22 to 39 years old make up 51% of the total global outmigration in 2024, with 27,400 young people aged 18 to 30 years old alone making up 38% of the total departures. They are at the start of their careers and are the most productive core group in society. What is more noteworthy is that the exodus is not only the general labor force, but also a large number of professional and technical talents. According to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, among the New Zealand residents in Australia, the percentage of those with university degree is as high as 38%, much higher than the 28% of New Zealand's native population. And the percentage of professionals such as doctors, nurses, engineers, teachers, and IT practitioners even exceeds 40%, with the most serious loss of personnel in the medical field. It may come as a surprise that New Zealand's per capita departure rate is already among the highest in the world. According to the United Nations Migration Agency's Global Migration Report 2023, New Zealand's per capita rate of overseas migration is 12.2%, second only to traditional migrant-sending countries such as Ireland and Georgia, and even higher than conflict-affected countries such as Syria and Afghanistan. Of course, the reasons for migration are quite different. New Zealanders are voluntary economic migrants, while those in conflict zones are forced refugees. But looking at the data, the impact of this mass exodus on homegrown development is actually similar. The impact of the population outflow on New Zealand is reflected in many ways. The first is the labor market imbalance. According to the New Zealand Ministry of Finance's Economic Outlook 2023 report, New Zealand's labor shortage will reach 100,000 in the next 5 years, with the skilled labor shortage accounting for more than 60%. This will directly lead to higher production costs and lower investment willingness of enterprises. Secondly, there is the loss of tax revenue. Most of the New Zealanders living in Australia are high-income earners, and their tax contributions are transferred to Australia, resulting in a loss of approximately NZD 2 billion in tax revenue to the New Zealand government every year. For a government that already relies on tax revenue to support public services, this is undoubtedly adding insult to injury. A set of data can illustrate the problem. The average monthly salary of a full-time employee in Australia in 2025 will be about $8,045.60, which is about NZD 8,770 converted at the current exchange rate. While the average weekly salary of a full-time employee in New Zealand in 2024 will be NZD 6,448, which will be about NZD 3,353,000 annually and about NZD 27,900 per month on average. Although the statistical dimensions are different, the salary gap is still obvious. Especially in the healthcare industry, Australian doctors' starting salaries are 25% to 30% higher than those in New Zealand, and there is more room for career advancement. The same is true in the education sector. The average salary of primary and secondary school teachers in New Zealand is about 60,000 New Zealand dollars, while the average salary in Australia is about 95,000 Australian dollars. With such a big gap, it is no wonder that people are willing to go to Australia for development. This agreement has a long history, dating back as far as the 1920s. At that time, the two countries signed the Trans-Tasman Reciprocal Agreement (TTRA), which established for the first time the principle of facilitating the movement of nationals to and from the country. 1973 saw the Trans-Tasman Travel Arrangement (TTD) come into force, and in October 2024, the revised Trans-Tasman Mutual Recognition Act (TMRA) continued to come into force. Its core provisions remain unchanged, namely that New Zealand and Australian nationals holding passports or other valid identity documents can freely enter each other's countries without visas and enjoy essentially the same rights as their own nationals to reside, work, study, and buy property there. Specifically, New Zealand nationals entering Australia do not need to apply for a visa in advance, and will automatically be granted a special category visa once they have passed through customs. New Zealanders holding this visa have almost the same rights as Australian citizens in Australia. They are free to take up employment without the need for employer sponsorship or vocational certification. They can attend public schools and enjoy free education at primary and secondary levels, and the same tuition fees as local students at universities. They can also apply for social welfare benefits, such as student loans, unemployment benefits, and pensions, and only need to satisfy the requirement of years of residency, and they can even take part in local elections, enjoying a high degree of freedom. Similarly, Australian citizens entering New Zealand are automatically granted an Australian citizen resident visa, which provides them with similar rights and entitlements. In December 2024, Australia passed the Customs Amendment Act, which further implements the ASEAN-Australia-New Zealand Free Trade Area (MFTA) agreement. Although the amendment did not directly adjust the rules of population movement across the Tasman Sea, it solidified the economic ties between the two countries and provided a more stable basis for free movement of people. This high degree of freedom of movement policy has significantly reduced the threshold and cost of New Zealanders migrating to Australia, compared with the immigration policies of other countries. There is no quota limit for migration between New Zealand and Australia, no language test, no need to consider occupational backgrounds, and no application fee, so it can almost be said to be just say goodbye, which is very attractive to young people. This is very attractive to young people. After graduating, many New Zealand university students choose to work in Australia for 2 to 3 years to accumulate work experience and wealth before returning to New Zealand to start their own business or employment. This kind of short-term relocation has become a common choice for the younger generation. In addition, New Zealand and Australia are both English-speaking countries, and the language difference is very small, with only some differences in accent and slang, which does not affect daily communication and work exchange. Culturally, the two countries are also very similar. Both are members of the Commonwealth and share a common history. Social systems, values, and lifestyles are also very close. Therefore, New Zealanders can quickly integrate into the local society without having to go through a cultural adaptation period after moving to Australia, and there is no sense of foreignness at all, so the psychological cost of relocation is very low. In addition, equal treatment in the field of education is one of the most important reasons for attracting young New Zealanders to Australia. Australia has 39 universities, and in the 2025 QS World University Rankings, 8 of them are ranked in the top 100. Such as the University of Melbourne, the University of Sydney, and the University of New South Wales, which are all globally renowned universities. Whereas New Zealand has only 8 universities, and none of them is in the top 100 of the 2025 QS World University Rankings. Whether it is the number of universities or the concentration of educational resources, Australia has a clear advantage. What's more, New Zealand students studying in Australia can enjoy the same tuition fees as local students, and can also apply for the Australian government's tertiary education loan program, which saves them a lot of money by not having to pay tuition fees in advance, and then repaying them when their income reaches a certain standard after graduation. Therefore, in 2024, there will be about 30,000 New Zealand students studying in Australia, and most of them will choose to stay in Australia for employment after graduation, because Australia has good education resources and many job opportunities. In addition, Australia's job market is also very open. New Zealand citizens do not need vocational certification or employer sponsorship to take up employment in Australia, and they can apply for jobs as long as they meet the requirements of the position, which contrasts with the strict restrictions on foreign labor in countries such as the United States and Canada. In addition, the size of Australia's economy is about 1.9 trillion Australian dollars, which translates to about 2.1 trillion New Zealand dollars, which is 2.75 times the size of New Zealand's economy in 2024, about 762 billion New Zealand dollars. Such a large economy naturally creates more job opportunities, especially in high-paying sectors such as healthcare, engineering, IT and finance, where there are far more opportunities than in New Zealand. It is also worth noting the differences in the superannuation system. The Australian government requires all employers to pay 10% or more of an employee's salary as superannuation, which cannot be deducted directly from the salary. Whereas in New Zealand, the percentage of superannuation is usually only 6 to 8% of the salary, half of which also needs to be deducted from the salary. This difference in benefits makes Australia more attractive to New Zealand workers. In fact, apart from the free migration policy between New Zealand and Australia, there is another very important reason why the population outflow from New Zealand is so serious, and that is the inherent limitation of New Zealand's economic structure. This limitation is closely related to New Zealand's geographical environment and population size, and it is indeed very difficult to change it. Geographically, New Zealand is located in the southwestern part of the South Pacific Ocean, consisting of the North Island, the South Island and several hundred small islands around it, with a total land area of about 270,000 square kilometers. New Zealand is about 2,200 kilometers away from the nearest major market, the east coast of Australia, about 8,000 to 10,000 kilometers away from major markets in Asia, such as China, Japan and Singapore, and more than 15,000 kilometers away from European and American markets. It can be said that New Zealand's geographical location is very remote. This remote geographical location has resulted in high transportation costs for goods and natural barriers to trade with these major markets in Asia, Europe, and the United States. According to the historical data of the New Zealand Customs, the average transportation cost of New Zealand's export commodities is 30% to 40% higher than that of Australia and 50% to 60% higher than that of Singapore, which is a very significant difference. Take agricultural exports, for example. New Zealand's dairy and meat and other agricultural products by sea to China takes 3 to 4 weeks. Transportation costs accounted for 15% to 20% of the total cost of exports, while Australia's agricultural products to China by sea only takes about 2 weeks. Transportation costs accounted for only 10% to 15%. As the shipping center of Southeast Asia, Singapore's goods to China by sea only need about 1 week time. Transportation costs accounted for an even lower proportion. Such high transportation cost makes New Zealand's export commodities in the global market price competitiveness greatly reduced. Especially labor-intensive and low-valuated products are difficult to compete with Asian and Australian products. In terms of industrial structure, New Zealand's economy is highly dependent on agriculture and real estate, which account for more than 40% of GDP, while high-value-added manufacturing and services account for a relatively low percentage. According to the data of Statistics New Zealand, agriculture includes planting, animal husbandry and fishery, accounting for 6.8% of the GDP, but the export of agricultural products accounts for 65% of the total exports, which makes New Zealand a veritable agricultural exporter. The real estate industry includes property development, leasing and brokerage services, accounting for 13.2% of GDP, together with real estate-related construction and finance. The total share reaches 28%, accounting for almost one-third of the economy's total output. In 2024, New Zealand's GDP growth rate is minus 0.1% compared to Australia's 1.4%. New Zealand's sluggish economic growth further highlights the drawbacks of its monolithic industrial structure. Although agriculture is New Zealand's traditional industry of strength, it has become one of the most productive countries in the world in terms of agricultural productivity thanks to its fertile soil, abundant water supply, mild climate, and modernized planting and farming techniques. New Zealand's agricultural products such as dairy products, meat, wool, and fruits have enjoyed a good reputation in the international market, and the export value has long ranked among the world's top. 2022, New Zealand's agricultural exports reached 46 billion New Zealand dollars, of which 23 billion New Zealand dollars was exported for dairy products, and 11 billion New Zealand dollars was exported for meat, which accounted for 18% of the global export market for dairy products and 12% of the global export market for red meat, respectively, and achieved a very excellent results. However, the limitations of agriculture are also evident. On the one hand, agriculture is greatly affected by natural conditions and price fluctuations in the international market, and its ability to resist risks is relatively weak. On the other hand, modern agriculture is highly mechanized, with relatively low demand for labor, making it difficult to create a large number of employment opportunities. Data show that the population engaged in agriculture in New Zealand accounts for only 5.2% of the total employed population, far lower than the 12.3% in the manufacturing industry and 78.5% in the service industry. Therefore, it is difficult for many young people to find good development opportunities in the agricultural field. Previously, due to the single economic structure and limited investment channels, a large amount of money poured into the real estate market, resulting in long-term high property prices. Since 2021, the government has introduced a series of regulatory policies, for example, raising mortgage interest rates, restricting investment in home purchases, and canceling property tax incentives, which continue to have an impact. And the volatility of real estate prices has had an impact on the real estate-dependent economy. At present, the average house price in Auckland is about $1,038,000, which is still at a high level. But the growth has stagnated, and the pulling effect of real estate on the economy has obviously weakened. In terms of high value-added industries, it is difficult for New Zealand to compete with other countries. Take the financial services industry as an example. As a global financial center, Singapore, by virtue of its superior geographic location, perfect legal system, low tax policy, and open market environment, has attracted many financial institutions around the world to move in, and has become a financial hub in Southeast Asia. New Zealand's financial services industry, on the other hand, is mainly oriented to the domestic market, with a very low proportion of international business, making it difficult to compete with Singapore. Similarly, in terms of the technology industry, Sydney and Melbourne in Australia have a broader market, more investment opportunities, and a more complete industrial ecology, attracting a large number of technology enterprises and entrepreneurs. On the other hand, New Zealand's technology industry is small in scale, mainly focusing on niche areas such as agricultural technology and environmental technology, making it difficult to form a scale effect. The manufacturing industry also faces the same problem, due to the small domestic market and high transportation costs. Except for some high value-added special manufacturing industries such as shipbuilding, precision machinery, etc., it is difficult for most manufacturing enterprises to compete with those in Asia and Australia, resulting in a continuous decline in the share of the manufacturing sector in the GDP, which has dropped from more than 20% in the 1980s to 12.3% at present, which is indeed regrettable. From the perspective of brain drain, Australia's attraction to young New Zealanders is mainly in two aspects, namely employment and education. In terms of employment, Australia's economy, which is 5.5 times larger than that of New Zealand, is able to provide more job opportunities, especially in high-paying sectors such as healthcare, engineering, IT, and finance. According to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, Australia's unemployment rate will be 4.1% in 2024, lower than New Zealand's 4.9%, making the job market more stable. In addition, salary levels in Australia are significantly higher, The average monthly salary for a full-time employee in Australia in 2025 will be around $8,045.60, which translates to around $8,770 in New Zealand dollars. Meanwhile, Australia's superannuation benefits are more generous, with employers contributing more than 10% of wages, compared to New Zealand's 6 to 8%, further widening the gap in real income. When it comes to specific industries, the gap is even more significant. The average annual salary of an Australian doctor is about 180,000 Australian dollars, which translates to about $197,000, while the average annual salary of a New Zealand doctor is about 140,000 New Zealand dollars, a difference of 40.7%. The salary gap in the IT industry is even more significant, with the salary level in Australia sometimes even reaching 3 to 4 times of that in New Zealand, which is why there are so many New Zealanders willing to go to Australia to develop their career in the IT industry. From the perspective of capital inflow, Australian tycoons and investors had flooded into New Zealand to buy houses, which is one of the important factors that pushed up local house prices. Despite the stagnant growth of New Zealand's national house prices in 2024 and Auckland's 1.3% year-on-year decline, Australian home buyers are still the mainstay of the overseas home buying community. Australians choose to buy a home in New Zealand for 3 main reasons: tax advantages, geographic and environmental advantages, and relatively low house prices. In terms of taxation, Australia's property tax policy is relatively strict, and home buyers need to pay a number of taxes and fees, such as stamp duty, land tax, capital gains tax, etc., whereas New Zealand's property tax policy is more relaxed. There is no stamp duty, land tax, and capital gains tax, and unless it is a speculative purchase of a home, it is only necessary to pay property tax annually, which is about 0.2% to 0.5% of the price of the house, thus significantly reducing the cost of taxation. For example, for a property valued at odd $7 million, you will need to pay around odd $210,000 in stamp duty to buy in Australia, whereas you will not need to pay this in New Zealand, and will only need to pay between NZD 14,000 and NZD 35,000 per year in property tax, which is extremely attractive to investors. In terms of geography and environment, New Zealand and Australia are very close to each other, and the flight time is only 3 to 4 hours, which makes transportation convenient. It is convenient for Australians to go to New Zealand for vacation and retirement. In addition, New Zealand's natural environment is very beautiful, with clean air, good law and order, and a forest coverage rate of 37.7%, much higher than Australia's 17.4%, making it one of the most livable countries in the world. Especially as Australia has faced increasingly serious natural disasters in recent years, such as forest fires, floods, and droughts, New Zealand's stable environment becomes even more attractive. Many wealthy Australians purchase vacation homes or retirement homes in New Zealand to hedge against the risk of natural disasters. The influx of Australian retirees has also brought considerable economic benefits to New Zealand. More than 10,000 Australian retirees will move to New Zealand in 2024, according to Immigration New Zealand. Most of them are over 65 years old, financially sound, and have a stable pension income. They buy property, spend money, and enjoy medical and pension services in New Zealand, bringing a lot of money to the local real estate, service, and medical industries. For example, the average annual spending of Australian retirees in New Zealand is about NZD 50,000, and the total spending of 10,000 people reaches NZD 500 million, which has a significant boost to the local economy. In addition, some retirees also choose to work in local nursing homes and community service centers, filling the manpower gap in New Zealand's aged care service industry and providing the necessary labor support. However, this two-way influence also brings some negative effects. Firstly, the brain drain has led to a tight labor market in New Zealand, especially the shortage of skilled personnel. In 2024, there was a net loss of 47,100 New Zealand citizens, further aggravating the problem of insufficient labor supply, which in turn restricts the economic development. On the other hand, the influx of wealthy Australians had once pushed up local house prices. Although house price growth slows down in 2024, the high base still makes it unaffordable for the general public. For example, the average monthly rent of a one-bedroom apartment in Auckland is 1,300 New Zealand dollars, while the average wage level in New Zealand is relatively low, which further squeezes the development space of young people, forming a vicious circle of rich people come to buy properties, young people outflow. In addition, the influx of retired Australians has also put pressure on the local healthcare and aged care system, and the government needs to invest more funds and resources to improve service quality, in order to make up for the labor gap caused by the exodus of young skilled personnel. The New Zealand government has long implemented a relatively loose skilled immigration policy, attracting a large number of immigrants from China, India, the United Kingdom, the Philippines and other countries in order to support economic growth with immigration. According to the data released by Statistics New Zealand 2025, the net migration to New Zealand in 2024 will be 27,100, much lower than the 128,300 in 2023. Among them, the net migration of non-New Zealand citizens is 74,200. Skilled immigrants still account for a relatively large number of immigrants, which are mainly used to fill the labor gap in the fields of healthcare, IT, engineering and education, and to a certain extent alleviate the labor tension. Most of these migrants have lived in New Zealand for 2 to 5 years. They have already adapted to the English-speaking environment and Western lifestyle, and have been given the right to move freely in Australia. So they chose to go to Australia to seek better development opportunities. There are 3 main reasons for this vicious circle. Firstly, Australia's economic and employment environment is more attractive. Australia has a larger economy, more employment opportunities, higher salary levels and lower unemployment rates. For professionally skilled migrants, Australia has more room for development. Secondly, immigrants do not have a strong sense of belonging to New Zealand. Most of the first-generation immigrants grew up and received education in their home countries and are more attached to the culture and society of their home countries. After living in New Zealand for a few years, they have not fully integrated into the local society and will choose to leave once they have better opportunities. Thirdly, the free movement policy of New Zealand and Australia. Migrants holding permanent residency or citizenship in New Zealand are free to move to Australia and enjoy rights basically the same as those of Australian citizens. This policy lowers the migration threshold for migrants, making it easy for them to choose to switch to Australia. The vicious circle of brain drain has had a negative impact on New Zealand's economic and social development in a number of ways. Firstly, it has led to wasted costs for the government in terms of migrant introduction. In order to attract skilled immigrants, the government has invested a lot of money in immigration promotion, application approval, language training, and job placement. However, the end result is that these immigrants choose to leave, making the government's investment not reciprocated. Second, the excessive mobility of immigrants has exacerbated the instability of the labor market, making it difficult for enterprises to plan their human resources on a long-term basis, increasing recruitment and training costs and affecting productivity. In addition, the brain drain also restricts industrial upgrading and innovative development. Technical talents are the core driving force of industrial upgrading and innovation, and the loss of a large number of technical talents has made it difficult for New Zealand to make breakthroughs in the field of high value-added industries, further aggravating the homogeneity of the economic structure. 2024 New Zealand's GDP growth rate is minus 0.1%, which is related to the lack of innovation vitality due to the loss of talents. In order to break this vicious circle, the New Zealand government has continuously adjusted its immigration policy. For example, the points-based immigration policy to be implemented in 2021 has raised the threshold of application for skilled immigrants, requiring applicants to have certain academic qualifications and work experience, as well as to meet the corresponding English language proficiency and points requirements, so as to attract immigrants who are genuinely interested in staying in New Zealand for a long period of time. In order to attract immigrants who really want to stay in New Zealand for a long time. In addition, the government has also introduced the regional immigration scheme to encourage immigrants to settle and work in remote areas outside Auckland by providing incentives such as bonus points and employment subsidies, with a view to spreading out the population distribution and alleviating the pressure of population and housing price hikes in Auckland. However, the effects of these policies have not been significant, as the relative lack of employment opportunities and amenities in remote areas makes it difficult to attract immigrants to settle there. In addition, The New Zealand government is also making efforts to increase domestic employment opportunities and raise salary levels. By increasing investment in areas such as the technology industry and high-end manufacturing, it encouraged corporate innovation and industrial upgrading to create more high-value-added employment opportunities. At the same time, the government is also pushing for wage increases, with New Zealand's minimum wage rising to 23 New Zealand dollars and 50 cents per hour in 2024, in order to narrow the pay gap with Australia. However, these measures require long-term efforts to bear fruit, and it is difficult to reverse the outflow of immigrants in the short term. 6,381 net immigrants from China in 2024, a significant decrease from 20,380 in 2023, reflects New Zealand's declining attractiveness to immigrants. Speaking of this, you may ask, can New Zealand's predicament be reversed or not? To be honest, the difficulty is very great because New Zealand is facing political, geographic and economic constraints, and it is difficult to solve the problem fundamentally with just one policy. From the political level, tightening the free migration policy with Australia faces great resistance. Currently, more than 620,000 New Zealand citizens have settled in Australia, accounting for 11.7% of the country's total population. This large group is an important voting force. In New Zealand's electoral system, overseas citizens also have the right to vote, as long as they have lived in the country for the past 3 years. Therefore, any party that tries to tighten the free movement policy may lose the support of this group of voters and face higher political risks. Moreover, the free movement policy is supported by the majority of the population in the country. This policy is not only good for personal development. Young people can go to Australia to work and older people can go to Australia to retire, but also for economic and cultural exchanges between the two countries. Although the latest polling data for 2024 is not available, judging by historical trends, support for the policy should still be high. This makes it difficult for the government to introduce policies to tighten the border. At the geopolitical level, the close relationship between New Zealand and Australia also constrains the room for policy adjustment. These two countries are not only geographic neighbors, but also political, economic, and military allies in many ways. Their interests in the South Pacific are highly aligned, and they jointly maintain the stability and security of the region. If the free migration policy is tightened, it will not only affect the civil exchanges between the two countries, but may also shake their alliance. This is something neither side wants to see. In addition, New Zealand and Australia have signed a number of bilateral agreements, including the Australia-New Zealand Closer Economic Relations Agreement and the Trans-Tasman Defence Cooperation Agreement, and passed the Customs Amendment Act in 2024, which further consolidates their economic and trade cooperation relationship and forms a close community of interest. Policy adjustments by either side need to take into account the reaction of the other side, which further increases the difficulty of policy adjustments. On the economic level, New Zealand faces great challenges in economic restructuring and industrial upgrading. New Zealand's economy is highly dependent on agriculture and real estate, and the proportion of high value-added industries is relatively low. In 2024, New Zealand's GDP growth rate is minus 0.1%, compared to 1.4% in Australia. The lack of economic growth highlights the shortcomings of its industrial structure. Industrial upgrading requires a large amount of capital, technology, and human resources, which is exactly what New Zealand lacks. In addition, New Zealand's small domestic market and high transportation costs make it difficult to attract large foreign enterprises to invest, which also restricts the process of industrial upgrading. For example, in the field of science and technology industry, despite the government's increased investment, due to the limited size of the domestic market, many science and technology enterprises have difficulties in making profits and have to seek overseas markets, which has led to the loss of some scientific and technological talents. Despite the many challenges it faces, New Zealand still possesses a number of advantages that provide a basis for resolving its predicament. First, New Zealand has a relatively low level of government debt and a sound fiscal position. According to the World Bank, New Zealand's government debt as a percentage of GDP in 2022 will be about 54%, lower than Australia's 58%, the United States' 130%, and Japan's 260%, which gives the government enough fiscal space to implement major economic reforms and industrial upgrading programs. Secondly, New Zealand's natural environment and livability are its core competencies. As one of the most beautiful and livable countries in the world, New Zealand attracts a large number of tourists, investors, and retirees, providing a boost to the economy. In 2024, New Zealand's overseas visitor arrivals totaled 3.3 million, an increase of 12% compared to 2023, and a recovery to 89% of its pre-epidemic level. The recovery of tourism has energized New Zealand's economy. In addition, New Zealand's education industry has certain advantages, attracting a large number of international students and bringing a stable source of income to New Zealand's economy. To truly break away from its predicament, New Zealand needs to adopt a series of long-term and systematic measures. First, it should speed up economic restructuring and industrial upgrading, reduce its reliance on agriculture and real estate, and vigorously develop high value-added manufacturing, service, and technology industries. The government can attract investment from domestic and foreign enterprises by increasing investment in research and development, providing tax incentives and constructing industrial parks to create more high-quality employment opportunities. Secondly, improve domestic salary levels and welfare benefits to narrow the gap with Australia and retain young people as well as skilled talents. 2024, New Zealand has raised the minimum wage to NZD 23.50 per hour. But it still needs to continue to promote wage growth and improve the welfare system of pensions and healthcare to enhance people's sense of belonging and happiness. In addition, the government should also increase its investment in education, healthcare, housing, and other livelihoods to improve the welfare level. At present, Auckland's housing prices have begun to stabilize and fall, which brings an opportunity to alleviate housing pressure. Lastly, New Zealand should also strengthen economic cooperation with Australia to achieve complementarity of advantages. New Zealand and Australia have strong economic complementarities. Australia has a large and highly skilled economy, while New Zealand has advantages in agriculture and tourism. The two sides can further strengthen cooperation in trade, investment, science and technology, and education, and jointly develop markets for mutual benefits. For example, the Australia-New Zealand Closer Economic Relations Agreement can be deepened to remove trade barriers and promote the free flow of goods, services, and capital. At the same time, cooperation in the areas of scientific and technological research and development and industrial upgrading can be strengthened, so as to jointly cultivate high-value-added industries, create more job opportunities, and attract young people to stay in the local area for development. To summarize, the population exodus and economic difficulties faced by New Zealand are the result of long-term accumulation. Data such as the net loss of 47,100 citizens in 2024, plummeting net migration, and negative GDP growth reflect the severity of the problem. The solution to this predicament requires the concerted efforts of the government, businesses, and the people to carry out profound reforms and adjustments in a number of fields, including politics, the economy, and society. Despite the difficulty, New Zealand is capable of achieving economic transformation and upgrading, thus attracting more young people to stay in the country and realizing the country's long-term stable development, as long as it gives full play to its own advantages in environment and finance, and seizes the opportunities for development such as the recovery of tourism. If you like today's video, please like it and share it with your friends around you. And please subscribe to my channel and turn on the little bell so you won't miss the next one. Your support is very important to us. We'll see you in the next installment. Bye.